Welcome back, guys. This is part 2 of the AP Biology Chapter 24 lecture. We left off talking about allopatric speciation. Um, Separated populations can evolve independently through mutation, natural selection, genetic drift. Essentially, we're isolating a gene pool. So all the things that we've studied so far about natural selection and evolution and gene flow and genetic drift and random mutation, all that stuff apply, but it's going to apply separately to uh, each gene pool. So as these populations become isolated, they get their own gene pools. Um, so here's an example of uh, reproductive isolation being caused by mutations, basically. So there are these isolated population of mosquito fish that now, even if you bring them together, you put them in a fish tank together, for example, they can't make babies that can make babies. So if you look in areas where there is a predator, much like we've talked about the selective pressure of sharks, there's a really good incentive to be bullet-shaped, to be hydrodynamic. Without predators, that's not an advantage. You want long, steady swimming that will help you save energy. So if you look over here, escape acceleration, when the predators are present, we see like a 98 meter per second escape rate, acceleration rate. The pond that has no predators, the acceleration rate is significantly lower. So those excuse me. So those mutations add up over time. Now the body shape becomes different. See, we have different markers. So they become those things add up to the point where even if you put them together, they can't make babies. They can make babies. I know that's a kind of a silly thing to say. I just keep trying to bring it back to that kind of basic example. Uh, Absolutely, we can separate things artificially. Fruit flies, for example, we've done a little bit with Drosophila. If we allow them to adapt to different diets over generations, then they they tend to choose mates that are adapted to the same diet. A lot of times we're manipulating the medium. So whether is it starch based? So are they eating a lot of starch or are they eating a lot of maltose, which is a type of sugar? So what you're seeing down here, mating experiments after 40 generations. So we let 40 generations go here, we let 40 generations go here, and then we see, we put them in one big container. You know, the 41st generation we put into one big container, and we see what happens. Read this like a Punnett square. So look at the like matings here, the like matings here, the non-like matings there. So that's pretty strong. Um, that's a pretty strong, I guess, correlation is the word I'm looking for. And if we look over here in our control group that was not grown in maltose and starch, they were all grown together, we see a pretty equal distribution. We've got a low number, so of course we're going to see fluctuations. We'd have to do a chi-square analysis to be 100% sure whether that's significant or not, but it certainly passes the eye test. It certainly looks like these males and females are finding each other, these males and females are finding each other, and then these guys are what's left. We see allopatric speciation in nature. Those snapping shrimp, your book talks a lot about them. I've got a picture here. They've diverged 3 to 9 million years ago as they became isolated, as basically as water dropped, as the sea levels dropped. This isthmus, that's a hard word for me to say, isthmus, separated these guys geologically. So essentially the exact opposite of the Grand Canyon forming, right? There we were digging land away. Here we're building land up. These guys became geographically isolated. So now even if you put them in the same tank, they can't reproduce. This makes a lot of sense, right? If you have a lot of geographic barriers, so if you have a lot of rivers or a lot of mountains, or if you're on an island chain, you're going to have more species into regions with few barriers, something like the Great Plains or large expanses of uninterrupted land. For sure, reproductive isolation is going to generally increase as the distance between them increases. I think this is kind of like a no-duh slide. Like all this stuff kind of makes sense. But physical separation alone is not enough. Physical separation is not enough to cause them to be separate species. They're separate populations, but until they can no longer breed to produce fertile offspring, they're still part of the same species. Sympatric speciation is the idea that we can have species diverge in the same homeland. Allopatric was other homelands. Sympatric is same homeland. Your book uses same country. I learned it as homeland, so that's going to be a hard habit for me to break. But there are a couple of examples, and let's just dive into polyploidy. We've seen polyploidy before. That's where we're going to double our entire set of chromosomes. Think about the difference between haploid and diploid. Well, now we're talking about diploid to tetraploid. So we're doubling our entire genome. Definitely much more common in plants than in animals. It's almost always fatal in animals. Plants, for some reason, can adapt. People that are smarter than me understand why plants can handle that a little bit better than I do. I don't have a great definition or a great answer for that. I just know that basically I've memorized this same bullet point that you're seeing today. Can produce new biological species within a single generation. Makes sense, right? If you've got twice as much DNA, when fertilization goes to happen, maybe you're talking about some kind of tree that has to be fertilized. That fertilization isn't going to happen because we don't have the DNA numbers just don't match up. An autopolyploid is going to be really common. I'm talking relatively here. So when polyploidy happens, it's common for it to be autopolyploidy. That's where you're self-fertilizing. Some plants can be self-fertilized, where you take the pollen from one flower, take it over to another flower, and you're self-fertilizing. So that's common because if you've got one non-disjunction, it seems to reason that you're going to have two non-disjunctions. So again, we're seeing diploid to tetraploid. Something causes the gametes to be diploid, then they fuse and we get a tetraploid. So again, if this is the same organism, it's much more probable that if you're going to have one diploid gamete, you're going to have multiple diploid gametes, and your zygote is then going to be tetraploid. Allopolyploid is same thing, but just comes from different species. Obviously, that's going to be more rare because you need polyploidy in two plants. They can successfully mate with each other because they both have double the DNA, but they're not going to be able to interbreed with their parent or their parent species. So here's kind of a picture. Let me click through to the end of that. So species B, species A, diploid equals 6, diploid equals 4. So we get a normal gamete here. We get a normal gamete here. Now the N equals 5. That hybrid is sterile. But when it goes through mitotic division, or it could be a meiotic division, I guess, we get a diploid species where the diploid number is 10. So it's fertile. It's got an even number, but it doesn't match this parent, doesn't match this parent, so it's not going to be able to crossbreed with any of the original species. At least 5 new plant species have arisen since 1850. There's an example. I am not going to attempt to pronounce that, but you see that 2 allopolyploid species have evolved from 3 diploid parent species. So 3 species kind of converged into one. And there's the picture that kind of demonstrates that process. Many of our crops are polyploids. We can use polyploidy to make sure that our seeds are terminator seeds and that they can't fertilize even if that's an option. So yeah, so that's kind of the summary of polyploidy. Sympatric speciation definitely can result from the appearance of new niches. So when climate change happens, that can cause sympatric speciation. You see that maggot fly example. Again, make sure you check your book for the specifics on these examples. I'm not trying to get too deep into the examples. I know you're all smart people. You can read those and you can get a lot out of it. So just real quickly to review allopatric and sympatric speciation. In allopatric speciation, you're separated. Other homeland. Stops that gene flow. Reproductive isolation then happens just because you're accumulating mutations. Natural selection is happening. Genetic drift is happening. Sexual selection is happening. So all of basically they're evolving separately, and at some point, those populations are going to become so different that if you put them together, they still can't breed. That's a speciation event. In sympatric speciation, there is a reproductive barrier first, and then maybe we get geographic changes. A lot of polyploidy, natural selection, sexual selection, same kinds of things. Typically, we're talking about polyploidy, and those are the ones that are tested heavily.